Alright, hello everyone, and welcome today. The famous duo Alex and Daniel hereby presents you a little documentary about the French Revolution, or the revolutions of all revolutions. So, before we get into really diving about the main concerns and events about this, we need to first understand what happened to France before the revolution started. So from 1774, King Louis XVI eventually takes up the throne in France because they were a monarchy, and he stayed up in power until 1789. And so during that time, he essentially strengthened himself to be an absolute monarch. And before him, his grandfather actually made a team of nobles that were more or less like a guidance council. He sent them away because he had no trust, because of some experiences with him in his childhood. And so, over his reign, France was pretty much in a horrible situation. It was like a roller coaster, up and then down, because they took part in the American Revolution, which costed them a lot. And so, albeit for a short time, he was able to revive France's economy and stabilize the country. But then he was very illusioned himself with luxuries, and that's no bueno. And so, yeah, the French Revolution occurred towards the end of his rule, and, well, spoilers, he eventually was executed. So when did it occur? Well, the French Revolution spanned for 10 years in length, from the first act of war to the last. The exact dates, May 5th, 1789 to November 9th, 1799. But this time frame is just about the fighting, because there are other events that are outside of the actual conflict, but they're still grouped up with the French Revolution. So where did it occur? Well, France. Where else are you going to have the French Revolution? Russia? I don't think Russia existed at that time yet. So, a lot of battles were occurring around the country, but one specific place was the Fortress Bastille in Paris. So you see, here's our main target, and here's pretty much the center of location for the revolution, or at least one hotspot. And so here's Bastille itself. Pretty nice looking fortress, if I say so myself. So, the tensions before the storm. And this time period may be inaccurate for the slide because I think I slightly went over for a bit. But, so, towards the latter half of 1786, King Louis's general controller, Charles, I'm not going to pronounce the rest of his name because I might mess it up, in order to help France recover from its budget deficiency, he decided, why don't we bring a tax reform to include everyone, even those that were exempted, which were the nobles, because they had big money stacks. And so, if they wanted to do this, King Louis then summoned an Estates General Assembly on May 5th, 1789, which is 3 years from when they were planning it. So, essentially there's 3 groups. The Third Estate, which were commoners, the king himself, and then the nobles. And I'm pretty sure there was like clergymen and a bit of religious people in there too. So essentially, forget about those people for right now, because the Third Estate, pretty angry, so they had a whole bunch of complaints for the king, and they wanted to end essentially the unfair representation and power in those sessions, because apparently the nobles could veto. Just one vote can just destroy the entire voting process, because essentially the Third Estate has become quite big in representation. I'm pretty sure they went from to around 94% representation of the people in France. That number may be wrong, but it was somewhere around 90. And so, one little thing to keep in mind is around this time, the Third Estate becomes or adopts the title of National Assembly, which is going to be very important for down the road. So, essentially, there was a fear that essentially there was going to be an overthrow, but besides this, the National Assembly worked on a constitution after getting enough representation and essentially ending the old government system on July 12th. So while chaos consumed the capital, a fear of an impending military coup or overthrow essentially skyrockets, and essentially it outbreaks 2 days later on July 14th, causing rioters to go for Bastille, which was where all the weapons and gunpowder were, and kicking off the French Revolution. Hooray! And so, because August was following July 14th into August, a lot of harsh feelings and tensions, and so the National Assembly essentially ended the feudalistic ways of old France, which was essentially one big king gives lands to multiple nobles, and then those nobles have to give up, or not give, but like have to like supply troops to the king. They essentially is a two-way connection. Big guy gives you land, little guy gives you like support for the king, in a nutshell. So here's a colorized depiction of the rioters. So here we got the Bastille fortress, which was all the weapons. You got the French soldiers firing away at the people inside in the fortress. A lot of common people, I'm pretty sure, depending on their clothes. Moving on. So, essentially, a constitution is born for France. August 4th, 1789, inspired by the Enlightenment movement, comes forth a new declaration to create equal opportunity of representation and freedoms not given to everyone under the old regime. And so on September 3rd, 1791, the National Assembly establishes a new constitution, making France a constitutional monarchy for a short period of time after they had to go through a lot of brain-racking thoughts and questions creating it. So here's the first page, the cover page of the Constitution itself. Pretty old, 1791. Moving on. So this is the second, around like towards the end of it, or nearing the climax. So a new constitution in effect. France declares war with Prussia, and Austria, because those rascals were thinking of bringing a revolution to all of Europe. But while that was happening, insurgents inside of France stormed the royal residence and arrested the king. And so there was a lot of massacres the following month. And so the National Assembly wasn't going to take it anymore. So they replaced the Legislative Assembly, which was made when the new constitutional monarchy was announced, ending the monarchy, and we got the Republic of France. The Reign of Terror. Oh boy, it's a hefty topic. But after the king gets tried, January 21st, 1793, he's executed because of treason and crimes against the state. And then 9 months later, his wife met the same way, but via guillotine. Essentially, you put the guy somewhere around here, giant blade, cuts their head off. And so, after this day, France essentially entered 10 months of bloody chaos. Bloody chaos, henceforth Reign of Terror. And so, the National Convention was divided. And so, there was two groups from it. Jacobins was one of them. And essentially, this group was able to control the National Convention, and they were quite radical because they established a new calendar and they wanted the eradication of Christianity. No big deal. And so they were the ones leading the 10-month period of executing suspected traitors or enemies of the revolution. Yeah. Napoleon Dynamite time? Oh boy. So, August 2nd, 22nd, 1795, people who did survive the Reign of Terror in the National Convention essentially threw away the old constitution or added on to it to make a bicameral legislative for France. Even though protests erupted over how power would lie within a 5-member directory group, but the army was led by Napoleon Bonaparte, and so he silenced them. Over 4 years of power, the directory group failed immensely, just relying on the military to keep France in line. And that's not really good, because eventually the revolution ends on November 9th, 1799, where Napoleon essentially took his military, overthrew a lot of the people, and he became the first consul of France. In conclusion, marking the end of the French Revolution because the working people rose up. And here's a picture of Napoleon, or at least a painting of how he might have looked. So, what caused it? So, we went into detail about some of them, but so some of the factors: poor economic state. France was broke. France was also seeing poor harvest seasons. So crops didn't grow well, couldn't get harvested well enough. And that also ties into the economic state, because I read that there was problems with the bread prices because they couldn't harvest their crops, so the bread prices skyrocketed. And eventually, people were very dissatisfied. And plus, the nobles and commoners were unsatisfied with the monarchy. So, those are 3 big points. So, who won? The revolutionary force is mostly the commoners and the working class. The losers, the monarchy, King Louis, and then some of the nobles. And so, how this relates to today? Well, we can learn that even in all the hell, people who can unite and overcome those who are oppressed with a plethora of many tactics. And plus, if we put pressure on the people who have power, then we can even keep in mind that we can get that change we want. Like in this case, they essentially made the government and they ripped it apart to build a better one. And so both the French Revolution's working class and today's working class are both experiencing some serious representation issue in the government. They're not very satisfied with the economic status and the sheer amount of the working class versus those in power or opposing them. Like, I'm pretty sure the working class takes up like 60% of the population today, probably more, because there's a giant triangle, and the top 1% are those people in power, while there's everyone else. And so, this is the end. Here's our sources. And I had fun researching this topic. Though, yeah. See you another time.